They filled my well with concrete while I was out working a long-haul route. And when I came back and turned on my kitchen faucet, nothing came out. Not a sputter, not a cough. Just that hollow, dry click that hits you right in the chest like something's wrong in a way you can't quite name yet. And I remember standing there longer than I should have, staring at that sink like it might change its mind if I gave it a second chance, like maybe I'd imagined it. But I hadn't, and deep down I already knew this wasn't some simple plumbing issue, because when you live the way I do, off your own land, off your own systems, you learn the difference between something breaking and something being taken. My name's Daniel Mercer, and I've lived on that piece of land outside of Pine Hollow, Kentucky my whole life, same land my grandfather settled during the Depression, back when people didn't ask permission to survive. They just figured things out with their own two hands. And that well wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a story. It was sweat and rope burns and stubbornness. My grandfather digging down foot by foot with a hand auger and a shovel until he hit water that never stopped giving, not through droughts, not through heat waves, not even when the creek dried up one summer back in '88 and folks were hauling bottled water in from 2 counties over. We never ran dry, not once. So when that faucet gave me nothing, I didn't call a plumber. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down into the basement, already feeling that slow burn building in my gut, the kind that doesn't flare up all at once but spreads steady, like it's got somewhere to be. And when I got to the well casing, I just stood there, solid, gray, packed tight to the top, concrete. For a second my brain didn't even process it, because it didn't make sense. Who does that? Who just fills a functioning well with concrete like it's trash, like it's nothing? But then I saw the paper taped to the back door upstairs, flapping a little in the wind when I opened it. And that's when it all clicked into place in the worst possible way. Violation notice. Illegal private water source eliminated. Property must connect to municipal supply immediately. Immediately. I remember reading that word twice, maybe 3 times, because the nerve of it, the sheer assumption that they could just walk onto my land and decide what I was allowed to use, what I wasn't, like I was just another lot number in their neat little grid, and not a man whose family had been on that soil longer than most of them had been alive. Now, if you've never dealt with a homeowners association, count yourself lucky, because they don't operate like normal people. They operate like they're doing you a favor while taking something from you. And a year before all this, that stretch of land next to mine got sold off to a developer, and within months up went this place called Cedar Ridge Estates. Rows of identical houses, trimmed hedges, sidewalks so clean they looked fake, and sprinklers, always the sprinklers, running twice a day, even when it rained, watering concrete as much as grass. And right in the middle of it all, a little clubhouse with a decorative fountain that probably used more water in a single afternoon than I did in a week. I kept to myself. They kept to theirs, at least at first, but it didn't take long before I started getting letters, polite at the start, talking about community standards and updated county guidelines, suggesting I connect to city water for consistency and safety, and I ignored them, because my water was tested every year, came back clean every time, and more importantly, it was mine. Then the tone changed. The letters got sharper. Deadlines started appearing. And eventually, they stopped asking. Turns out, they'd decided for me. I tracked down the company name stamped on the violation notice and drove into town the next morning, still wearing my work boots, still carrying that paper folded in my back pocket like evidence in a trial nobody had told me I was part of. And the office was one of those prefab places with glass walls and fake plants, the kind that tries to look professional but feels temporary, like it could pack up and disappear overnight if it had to. The foreman was sitting behind a desk, mid-40s maybe, tired eyes, hands that still looked like they'd done real work once. And when I put the notice down in front of him and asked him straight up if his crew had filled my well, he didn't deny it, didn't even hesitate, just leaned back in his chair and said, "We were contracted to do the job." HOA signed off on it. Just like that. Like it was routine. Like it was nothing. I asked him if there'd been a court order, an inspection, anything official beyond a clipboard and a check, and he shook his head, slow, almost apologetic, but not enough to matter. They said it was a health risk, he added, like that made it better, like that justified pouring concrete into something that had worked fine for 60 years. I remember laughing then, not because it was funny, but because it was so far past reasonable that it looped back around into something almost absurd, and I said, "You ever test that water?" He didn't answer. Didn't need to. They figured you'd just hook up to city lines, he said after a second, like he was offering me a consolation prize. Happens all the time. Yeah, I bet it does. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, sitting in their matching kitchens and their HOA meetings and their carefully managed version of order, was that they hadn't just taken something from me. They'd picked a fight, and not with a man who needed their system to survive. Because about 20 years earlier, long before Cedar Ridge Estates was even a sketch on a developer's desk, the county had come knocking on my door with a different kind of request, one that most folks probably would have turned down, but I saw the angle in it right away. They needed land for a sewage lift station, said my property sat at the lowest point in the whole area, perfect for gravity-fed lines, efficient, cost-effective. All those words they like to use when they want something from you. And in return, they offered a lease. Monthly payments. Long-term. Access rights limited and clearly defined. And most importantly, control. I signed that agreement, and a small concrete building went up at the edge of my back pasture, quiet, unassuming, easy to forget if you didn't know what it did, but I knew. Every pipe from that future neighborhood, every toilet flush, every shower drain, every kitchen sink, it would all pass through that station before heading up to the treatment plant on the hill. Back then, it was just a smart deal. A little extra income. A piece of infrastructure I barely had to think about. But standing there in that office, holding that violation notice, picturing my grandfather's well buried under a slab of concrete, it stopped being just a deal. It became leverage. And for the first time since I'd turned that faucet and heard nothing, I felt something else settle in beside the anger, something colder, quieter, more patient. Because they thought they'd force me into their system. What they didn't realize was that their entire system ran through me. I didn't do anything right away, and that's probably the part people don't expect when they hear this story, because they imagine I stormed back out there that same day, flipped some switch, made a scene, but that's not how it went, not at all. I went home, sat at my kitchen table with a glass I couldn't fill, and just listened to the silence in that house, the kind of silence that used to feel peaceful but now felt wrong, like something had been taken out of the rhythm of the place, and I let that sit with me for a while, because anger's easy, anger burns fast, but what I needed was something steadier. That night, I drove out to the back pasture, parked near the lift station, and just sat there with the engine off, watching that little concrete building hum like it always did, steady, reliable, doing its job without anyone thinking twice about it. And I remember thinking how strange it is, the things people depend on the most are usually the things they understand the least. Cedar Ridge Estates lit up the hill in the distance, porch lights glowing, TVs flickering behind curtains, families going about their evening routines without a clue, showers running, dishes being washed, toilets flushing, all of it moving downhill, all of it passing through that one point on my land before getting pushed up toward the treatment plant. And for the first time since they built that neighborhood, I didn't see it as background infrastructure. I saw it as a single point of failure. And I knew exactly where the switch was. Still, I didn't touch it, not yet. The next morning, I made a few calls, not to lawyers, not yet, but to the county office that had originally set up the lease, and I asked some very specific questions, the kind you only ask when you already think you know the answer, but need to hear it out loud anyway. What were my rights regarding access, maintenance, operational control? What happened if the system was shut down due to property access limitations? And the man on the other end, older voice, sounded like he'd been in that department longer than most. He pulled up the file and read it back to me in that careful, neutral tone. The lift station is located on private property under voluntary lease agreement. Operational access requires landowner cooperation. County does not have authority to forcibly enter without due process. I let that hang for a second before asking. And if access is restricted? There was a pause, paper shuffling. System functionality may be compromised. Maybe. That was as close to confirmation as I needed. I thanked him, hung up, and sat there for a long moment, staring out at the dry patch of dirt where my well used to be, and I thought about my grandfather, about the way he used to say that independence isn't about having everything. It's about not needing anyone who doesn't respect what's yours. And right then, I realized something. This wasn't about water. Not anymore. It was about respect. Or the lack of it. I drove into town again that afternoon, this time straight to the Cedar Ridge Estates office, a newer building than the contractor's place. Polished, clean, with a big sign out front like they were proud of what they'd built. and inside it smelled like fresh paint and coffee, the kind of place designed to make complaints feel smaller than they are. The receptionist smiled at me like I was there to ask about property values, not confrontation, and when I told her I wanted to speak to the HOA president, she hesitated just long enough to let me know this wasn't something they usually allowed, but I guess there was something in my tone, or maybe just the fact I didn't look like I was going anywhere. Because a few minutes later, she led me back to an office with glass walls and a man sitting behind a desk that looked like it cost more than my truck. His name was Richard Halston. Late 50s, pressed shirt, that kind of calm that isn't really calm, just practiced. He didn't stand up when I walked in, didn't offer his hand, just nodded toward a chair like he was granting me a favor. "Mr. Mercer," he said, like he already knew exactly who I was. "I assume you're here about the water compliance issue." Compliance. I sat down, took the folded notice out of my pocket, and set it on his desk between us. "You filled my well with concrete." He didn't flinch. It was determined to be a non-compliant private water source under updated municipal guidelines. "You had no right. We had a responsibility," he corrected, smooth as anything, leaning back slightly. "Your well posed a potential health risk to the community." I couldn't help it. I smiled a little at that. "Tested every year," I said. "Cleaned every time." He waved that off like it didn't matter. "Regulations change. Standards evolve. We can't make exceptions for individual preferences." Individual preferences. Like my family's water supply was some kind of hobby. "You ever think about asking?" I said. He tilted his head, just slightly. "We sent multiple notices. You didn't wait for an answer. We acted in the best interest of the community." There it was again, that word. Community. Used like a shield. Used like it gave them permission to decide what was best for someone else. I leaned forward a little then. Not aggressive, not loud, just enough to shift the tone. "You ever been out to my property, Richard?" First time I used his name. He noticed. "I'm familiar with the location." "Then you know about the lift station." That got a pause. Small, but real. "Yes," he said carefully. "County infrastructure. On my land. Under lease. Which requires my cooperation." He straightened slightly, the first crack in that polished composure. "Are you suggesting you would interfere with a public utility?" I shrugged, leaned back again. "I'm saying you already interfered with mine." For a second, neither of us spoke, and in that silence I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out if I was bluffing, if this was just talk, or if there was something more behind it. And I didn't rush it, didn't push. I just let him sit in that uncertainty. Finally, he said, "I think it would be in everyone's best interest if we resolve this through proper channels." I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "I think so too." And then I stood up and left. No threats. No raised voices. Nothing he could point to later and say I'd crossed a line. Because I hadn't. Not yet. The next morning, just after sunrise, I walked out to the lift station with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a small wrench in the other. The air still cool. Quiet in that way it only is before a place wakes up. And I remember hearing birds whine through the grass. Normal things, steady things. And it struck me how none of this felt dramatic from the outside. No music, no warning signs. Just a man walking across his own land toward a building he had every legal right to access. Inside, the control panel was exactly where it had always been. Metal box, a little worn around the edges, indicator lights blinking in that steady rhythm, and right there, the main disconnect. Simple, functional, overlooked by anyone who didn't know better. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the panel, and I'll be honest. I thought about stopping, about calling a lawyer, about dragging this out the right way, months of paperwork, hearings, maybe a settlement if I got lucky, and maybe that's what most people would have done. But then I thought about that concrete in my well, about my grandfather's hands, about a decision made without me, and something in me settled. Quiet. Certain. I flipped the disconnect. Just like that. No spark. No sound beyond the hum cutting off. The lights on the panel dimmed, and then went still. I removed the handle, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and stepped back outside into the morning air, which felt exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier, like nothing had changed, except everything had. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, I was back inside when my phone started buzzing. Unknown numbers at first, then a couple from the county, then one labeled Cedar Ridge office, and I let them all go to voicemail, not out of spite, just because I knew this part needed to unfold on its own. Around noon, I drove up toward the edge of the development, parked where I could see without being seen, and watched. At first, it was subtle. A maintenance truck pulling up to the clubhouse. A couple of residents stepping outside, looking confused. Then more movement. People talking. Phones out. And then, the first signs. A man came out of one of the houses, walked over to a storm drain, and just stood there staring down into it like it might explain something to him. It wouldn't, because by then, the system had already started backing up. By the end of that first day, you could feel it in the air, not just the smell, though that came soon enough, creeping in slow and sour like something alive, but the tension, the confusion, the way people moved differently when something they took for granted suddenly stopped working and nobody could tell them why. And I stayed just far enough away to watch it unfold without being part of it. Sitting in my truck at the edge of that perfect little neighborhood as it started to come apart at the seams. Plumbers showed up first, vans lined along the curb, guys hauling tools from house to house, checking lines, running augers, doing everything they knew how to do, and every single one of them came up with the same answer. Nothing wrong here, nothing wrong there, which only made it worse, because when the problem isn't in your house, it means it's somewhere bigger, somewhere you can't fix with a wrench and a couple hours of labor. By evening, people were starting to realize that. Driveways filled with cars that weren't leaving. Families stepping outside, talking in tight little circles. Kids getting pulled back indoors when the smell started getting stronger, heavier, like the whole place was exhaling something it couldn't hold in anymore. And still, no one thought to look downhill. Day 2 was when the panic really set in. I woke up to a voicemail from the county, another from someone at the HOA, both using that same careful tone people use when they're trying not to sound desperate, asking for a conversation, for cooperation, for immediate access to inspect the lift station. And I listened to them while sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee I'd brought in from town because my sink still ran dry. And I remember thinking how strange it was, how quickly the language had changed. No more requirements. No more compliance. Now it was requests. I didn't call back. Instead, I drove into town, took my time, had breakfast at a small diner where nobody cared about municipal water lines or HOA regulations, just eggs and coffee and the kind of quiet that feels earned. And I let the situation stretch a little longer, not because I enjoyed it, though I won't pretend there wasn't a part of me that felt something close to satisfaction, but because I needed them to understand. Some lessons don't land unless they hurt. By midday, the news had started picking it up. Local at first, then regional. Unexplained sewage backup in Cedar Ridge estates. Footage of residents standing in their yards, hands on hips, shaking their heads, some angry, some embarrassed, all of them caught off guard by something they didn't see coming. And somewhere in there, I saw Richard Halston on camera, still composed, still trying to control the narrative. "We are working closely with county officials," he said, voice steady, "to resolve an unexpected infrastructure issue." Unexpected. I almost laughed. By day 3, it stopped being inconvenient and started being unbearable. Basements flooded. Not clean water. Not something you could mop up and move on from. But waste, thick and dark, and carrying the kind of smell that sticks to everything it touches. Furniture, walls, the air itself. And you could see it in people's faces now. That shift from frustration to something more raw. Anger. Real anger. I drove past slow that afternoon, windows up, but it didn't matter. You could still smell it. And I saw HOA board members standing near the clubhouse, shoes ruined, pants rolled up, arguing with county officials who looked just as stuck as everyone else. Because without access to that station, there wasn't a whole lot they could do. That's when Richard called me directly. No assistant. No buffer. Just him. I let it ring a couple times before picking up. "Daniel," he said, skipping the formalities now. "We need to resolve this." I leaned back in my chair, phone to my ear, looking out at that same patch of land where my well used to be. "You already resolved something," I said. "Remember?" A pause. Then, tighter, "This affects hundreds of families. And mine didn't." "That's not the same." "It is to me." Silence again, heavier this time. Finally, he exhaled, the first crack in that polished voice I'd heard in his office. "What do you want?" There it was. Not policy. Not regulation. Just a man asking another man what it would take. "I want my well back," I said. "Properly drilled. Not filled in. Not patched. Rebuilt. That can be arranged. I want damages covered." Another pause. "Within reason." I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it. No. Fully. And then I added the part one knew he wouldn't like. And the lease for that lift station gets renegotiated. That one hit hard. That agreement is already in place, he said quickly. I corrected. Before you decided my property was something you could alter without asking. That's county infrastructure. On my land. Another silence, longer this time, stretched thin with everything neither of us was saying out loud. What are you proposing? He asked finally. Triple the rate, I said. 10 years prepaid. He actually let out a short laugh at that, disbelief more than humor. That's absurd. So was pouring concrete into a working well. We sat there in it, back and forth without words. And then, quieter now, you're holding an entire community hostage. I thought about that for a second. About the word hostage. About what that meant. And then I said, no, I'm just not helping them. That's the part people argue about when they hear this story, whether what I did was justified, whether I crossed some line that shouldn't be crossed, and maybe that's fair. Maybe there's a version of this where I take the high road, where I file complaints, wait months, let the system work itself out. But here's the thing. They didn't give me that option. They made a decision for me. So I made one for myself. It took 4 weeks. 4 long, miserable weeks for Cedar Ridge Estates. Real estate listings pulled. Open houses canceled. Families staying with relatives. Hotels filling up. The whole place gaining a reputation nobody wanted. In the media, they had a field day with it. One headline called it the flush crisis of Pine Hollow. Another went with when infrastructure fights back. And through all of it, that little building on my land stayed quiet. Still, waiting. Until one morning, I got another call. Not from Richard this time. From a lawyer. Terms laid out clean, professional, no attitude left in them at all. They agreed to everything. New artesian well, professionally drilled. Full filtration system. Complete damage compensation. Permanent exemption from municipal water requirements. And the lease, rewritten exactly the way I'd asked. We met 2 days later. Not at their office. Not at mine. At a hotel off the highway, because it was one of the only places left with working plumbing. There's a kind of irony in that you don't fully appreciate until you're standing in it, signing papers in a building that still functions because it's outside the system that just failed. And Richard was there, looking different now, not weaker exactly. Just aware, like he'd finally seen the part of the equation he'd ignored before. We didn't say much. Didn't need to. Signatures went down. Documents exchanged. And when it was done, I drove back home, walked out to that lift station one more time, took the handle out of my pocket, and flipped the system back on. The hum returned. Low. Steady. Like nothing had ever happened. Within hours, things started moving again. Slow at first. Then normal. Like a bad dream the neighborhood would rather forget. A few weeks later, they drilled the new well. Deeper than the last. Cleaner. Modern equipment and all that. But when I took that first drink from it, I'll be honest, it didn't taste the same. Maybe it was just in my head. Or maybe some things, once taken and given back, never quite feel like they used to. I still live there. Still keep to myself. Cedar Ridge is quieter now, not physically, but in the way people carry themselves, like they understand something they didn't before, like they've learned that not everything can be managed, controlled, or standardized into compliance. And every now and then, I catch someone glancing down toward my land, toward that little concrete building, like they finally know it matters. So here's the question, because I know people are split on this. Did I go too far? Or did I just meet force with force? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because out here, between rules and respect, that line isn't always as clear as people think.